This episode discusses topics related to suicide and mental health, which some listeners may find distressing. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out to a trusted friend, family member, or mental health professional. You are not alone. Help is available. In the United States, you can call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's available 24 hours, 7 days a week. In the UK, contact Samaritans at 116-123. In Australia, reach out to Lifeline at 131114. For other countries, please visit findahelpline.com for a global directory of mental health resources. Listener discretion is advised.
Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide, recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. Antoine Herran was 28 years old when he left France for what was meant to be a 3-week vacation in Australia in April of 1998. On the day he was supposed to return home, he reportedly jumped off the Gap, a series of towering cliffs over Sydney. Authorities later recovered a body they believed to be his. However, when Antoine's family arrived in Australia, they were stunned to find out the body did not belong to him. This sparked a lot of speculation that Antoine orchestrated an elaborate plan to fake his own death. Despite no confirmed sightings or evidence of his whereabouts, his family continues to hold out hope that advances in DNA testing might one day uncover the truth they've been searching for. In this episode, we're headed all the way back to 1998, Sydney, Australia. At that time, everyone was talking about and preparing for the 2000 Summer Olympics. Construction of Olympic venues like the Sydney Olympic Park and the redevelopment of key areas like Homebush Bay were well underway. The Olympics brought international attention to Sydney, and the people had a growing sense of pride and excitement about hosting such a major global event. Technology and tourism were rapidly changing and increasing, and both brought a period of economic growth to Australia's financial hub. And this meant the construction of new office buildings, residential complexes, and big projects. The late 90s are considered the golden era for Sydney's nightlife. There were thriving club and bar scenes, especially in King's Cross, Surrey Hills, and Darlinghurst. The clubs played a variety of music genres, including dance, house, and rock. Along with Sydney's Mardi Gras and new LGBTQ+ events, the city was gaining increasing notoriety as the trendy place to party. Tourism was already a significant industry for both international and domestic travelers, with international visitors primarily from New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United States. Sydney was a top destination because of the famous Sydney Opera House, Sydney Harbour Bridge, and Bondi Beach. The Great Barrier Reef continued to be one of Australia's premier tourist attractions, giving people a unique underwater experience. Tourists wanted to get into all the outdoor adventures Australia had to offer, with the wildlife being a major draw. Many people had never seen iconic species like koalas, kangaroos, platypuses, and crocodiles in their natural habitats. The last place Antoine was known to be was a well-known coastal cliff area located in Watson's Bay on the southeastern edge of Sydney Harbour, called the Gap. The cliffs rise dramatically above the water, with some spots reaching heights of up to 217 feet. Visitors enjoyed stunning views of the ocean, the entrance to Sydney Harbor, and the rugged coastline of Sydney Harbor National Park. On clear days, you could see all the way to the Tasman Sea. Now, historically, the Gap was an important point for sailors navigating into the harbor. Its high cliffs and surrounding rugged terrain made it a distinctive landmark for ships coming into port. There is also a significant cultural importance to the indigenous people in the country, so they consider it quite sacred. Coastal areas like the Gap would have been important meeting places where groups from different parts of the nation or surrounding regions would gather, trade, and socialize. The Gap is known as one of the best vantage points in Sydney, the well-maintained lookout area that draws locals and tourists to admire the views and take photos. But there is a dark side to the Gap, because for decades it's been associated with tragic stories of suicide. Incidents date back to the early 20th century, with the sheer high cliffs providing a fatal backdrop to the rocks and ocean below, making it perfectly accessible for those in distress. In fact, some sources estimate that since the early 20th century, hundreds of people have taken their lives at the Gap, and there are dozens of suicides there annually. Because the media has widely reported the Gap's reputation as a suicide spot, it's likely unintentionally contributed to its notoriety. So it was already a well-known site for suicides by the 1990s. One of the most moving stories connected to the Gap is that of Don Ritchie, a local resident who lived near the cliffs and spent decades intervening to prevent these suicides. Over a period of 50 years, he's credited with saving over 160 lives by approaching individuals contemplating suicide and offering them a kind word, a listening ear, or an invitation to come back to his home for tea. Don Ritchie's compassionate actions earned him numerous awards, including the Order of Australia Medal. He became a symbol of the power of kindness and human connection in suicide prevention. In recent years, local authorities, mental health organizations, and community members implemented various measures to reduce the suicides at the Gap. High fences have been put up along certain parts to act as a deterrent. CCTV cameras have been installed, lifeline and helpline signs have been put up, and there are signs with messages of hope, reminding people that support is available and that their lives are valuable. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Gap was the last place anyone has ever seen Antoine, which would lead many to believe he joined the others that so tragically took their own lives. But that may not be the case. Antoine was born on April 18, 1970, and lived in Rennes, France, with his mother, who was a pharmacist, his father, who was a teacher, and his older sister, Sophie. During that time, the city was undergoing significant cultural, economic, and social transformations. In the 1980s and 90s, it became a hotspot for alternative music and youth culture. It was a key player in the rise of French rock and electronic music, probably because the city's vibrant university scene was thriving, with students accounting for the majority of the population. And because of the university, Rennes was a center for student activism and labor movements due to the social unrest and reform efforts in France. Movements related to not just labor rights, but also feminism, environmentalism, and anti-globalization were all prominent during this time. Now, in 1981, homosexuality was decriminalized in France, and this marked a significant shift in the legal status of LGBTQ+ individuals. In the 1990s, activism for LGBTQ+ rights gained momentum, with increasing visibility in cultural and political spaces. Even though progress was being made, being openly gay was still challenging. Discrimination, homophobia, and societal stigma were prevalent, particularly in more conservative or rural areas. The AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s further complicated societal attitudes. The weather in Rennes is generally rainy throughout the year, with mild and temperate temperatures year-round. Late spring and summer have more pleasant temperatures and lower chances of rain. Now, cold, rainy days are just not my vibe, and I think Antoine felt the same. The weather and the social changes of the time and living in a small town really pushed him to explore the rest of the world. Australia had a special place in Antoine's heart, having visited several times. He loved the warm weather, the ocean, and the freedom of being in a new country. The late 90s were a transformative time in Australia, characterized by reconciliation efforts with the Indigenous community, globalization of the economy, technological advancements, and cultural shifts. It was a period of growing multiculturalism, rising environmental consciousness, and debates over Australia's identity on the global stage. Things were growing and changing, and Antoine loved being in the midst of it. He said Australia was his favorite place and told his family his dream was to work and live there. But at that time, immigration policies were becoming more selective, with an emphasis on skilled migrants that would contribute to a growing and diverse workforce. Tensions around immigration policies were surfacing, mostly due to asylum seekers arriving by boat. Now, adding to that, youth culture in the 90s were dealing with issues like unemployment, mental health, and substance abuse. Ecstasy and amphetamine use became more common in nightclub scenes, and heroin overdoses continued to increase. From Antoine's point of view, though, Australia looked like the promised land. It was sunny and warm, with a lot of diversity. But underneath the surface were the same types of problems that many countries were having: immigration, drugs, unemployment, mental health. Before Antoine left for his 3-week vacation in Australia, he had lost his job and wasn't really doing that well. The Christmas before he left was the first one where he didn't bring any gifts, and his family noticed that he had an air of sadness. It wasn't just a holiday sadness. Something else was going on with Antoine, and his family just didn't know what it was. Antoine arrived in Australia on March 17, 1998 for his 3-week holiday, with plans to return home on April 12th. Today, we have a digital footprint of everything someone does while they're on vacation. Most people love to post their vacation photos and selfies enjoying their adventures. But in 1998, social media as we know it did not exist. The internet was dial-up, and online communities revolved around forums, chat rooms, and early networking sites. People could create their own personal websites with quirky designs or use blogging platforms to share personal thoughts, but it was nothing like it is today. So there aren't any photos or posts written about Antoine's experiences in Australia. What we know is that he soaked in the sun, took helicopter rides, swam in the ocean, and basically explored the country. He likely did all the things any typical tourist would do on vacation. But several days before he was scheduled to fly back to France, he did something a little off course for most tourists. He visited an immigration office in Sydney and asked how he could legitimately and legally move to and live in Australia. The answer was not the one he wanted to hear. They told him he didn't have much of a chance, but if he wanted to try, he would have to go back to France and start the paperwork from there. They said it would take a lot of time, and it was a very difficult process, and his chances were slim to none. Just 2 days before he was scheduled to leave Australia, he called home and spoke to his mom, just to check in. He didn't mention his thoughts about moving there, nor that he had spoken to immigration about it. In fact, the phone call didn't raise any red flags with his family at all. He sounded rested and happy to have gone on vacation. His mom told him to let her know when he made it home because she was visiting his sister in Italy and his father would be away on a work trip. And that was the last time anyone in Antoine's family ever heard from him. During this part of his trip, Antoine was staying in a hotel in Surrey Hills, which today is a vibrant, trendy, and diverse suburb located just southeast of Sydney's central business district. But back in 1998, Surrey Hills was in the midst of gentrification, but still retained a more working class and industrial feel. It had a reputation for being a bit rough around the edges, with pockets of poverty and a much higher crime rate than today. There was a noticeable homeless population, and parts of the area were known for street prostitution. But it was already a significant hub for Sydney's LGBTQ+ community, due to its proximity to Oxford Street, which was the heart of the city's gay nightlife scene. There are many reasons Antoine could have been staying in that area. It was close to downtown Sydney, a few miles from some of the best beaches in the area, and also would have been much more affordable. On April 11th, Antoine left Surrey Hill and caught a ferry to Watson's Bay, which takes about 30 to 40 minutes. He then went to Sydney Airport to check in for his flight home. He checked his bags and requested a middle seat, which struck the airport worker as a strange request, but he assumed maybe he was a nervous flyer. After getting himself checked in, he promptly left the airport and set out for Circular Quay, the nearby central transportation hub. From there, he hopped on a ferry headed back to Watson's Bay. Once he landed in Watson's Bay, he walked the 15 to 20 minutes along the scenic coastal path to the Gap, arriving sometime around 4 p.m. This was Easter Sunday, so there were plenty of tourists and locals in the area, many of whom noticed Antoine. Between 11 and 11:30 that night, police received a 000 call, which is the emergency call in Australia, kind of like dialing 911 in America. The call came from a phone booth next to the stairs at the Gap. The man on the other end said he had just witnessed a person jump off the cliff and requested an ambulance at the scene. When paramedics arrived, the caller was nowhere to be found. A quick check of the area revealed a backpack with a flashlight shining on it, sitting right next to the edge of the Gap. It was obvious that whoever left it wanted it to be found, and when they looked in it, they found some identification for Antoine Herran. Now, they also found the phone number for Lifeline and the number for the Coast Guard, but what they didn't find was his passport. And because of the backpack, they assumed Antoine was the jumper and started searching for his body. Pretty soon, they found not one, but 2 bodies. Because like I mentioned, it was a very popular suicide spot. They found the bodies of a woman and a 27-year-old man they assumed to be Antoine. Around the time authorities found the bodies, Antoine's family back in France had a bad feeling because he hadn't checked in with them and he was scheduled to be home. His mother was staying with his sister in Italy and his father was away on a work trip. So they had Sophie's ex-husband stop by the house to look for Antoine. And while he didn't find any sign of Antoine, there was a message on the answering machine from Australia. He wrote down the number and sent it to Antoine's sister to call. When she called, there was a lot of confusion. They told her he took his own life, but she had a hard time understanding English, so she didn't know what that meant. After some searching, they eventually tracked down someone who spoke French, who came to the phone and told her Antoine committed suicide. Sophie and her mother then got a hold of her father and told him something was very wrong and to meet them at home in France. And once they were all together, they told him what happened. The family was understandably devastated, and they booked the first flight to Sydney. When they landed, police met them at the airport and drove them straight to the morgue to identify the body and fill out the necessary paperwork. But imagine their complete and utter shock when they walked in and the body was absolutely not Antoine. They were relieved, but so confused, because if it wasn't Antoine's body, whose body was it? And where was Antoine? And how was he connected? Police realized they obviously made a huge mistake and needed answers, so they went back to the drawing board. They discovered the body was actually that of a patient from a nearby psychiatric facility who had escaped and jumped off the cliffs after the call was made. So this body had nothing to do with Antoine, and whoever made the emergency call could not have seen anyone jump. Detectives listened to the call again, and realizing the caller sounded French, played it for Antoine's family, who immediately identified his voice and strong French accent. They thought he sounded a little stressed, but not scared or anything too out of the ordinary. When detectives re-listened to the tape, they thought he sounded a little too calm to have made the decision to jump off the cliff. So now they realized it was Antoine that called 000, lied that he saw someone jump from the cliffs, left his backpack at the edge where it would easily be found, and now he was missing. Right away, authorities assumed that because there was no trace of Antoine, his passport was missing from his backpack, and the emergency call was fake, that he faked his own death to assume a new identity so he could stay in Australia. They believe he loved Australia so much that he was willing to give up everything to start a new life on the other side of the world. And although his family thought there could be another answer, like maybe he witnessed something he shouldn't have, or was the victim of foul play, there was no evidence, so they assumed the detectives were right. Sadly, just 3 days later, the family left Australia without any answers. Authorities told them they didn't know where Antoine was and that he's an adult, so he can do what he wants and doesn't have to tell his family. A coroner's inquest into Antoine's disappearance returned an open finding, which simply means the coroner could not determine if Antoine is alive or dead, meaning they don't know. Since then, there has never been a single sighting of Antoine. Nothing. He's never reached out to his family or anyone that knows him, and his body has never been found. So what happened to Antoine Herran, and where is he now? There are no clues, but there are some theories.
Ever wondered why people go on killing sprees?
Are you interested in exploring the paranormal?
Baffled by stories of previous lives?
Well, so are we.
In each episode, we'll be discussing the weird and wonderful stories of some truly confusing phenomenons and some horrific true crime cases.
Find us on Facebook, Instagram and TikTok and join us every Tuesday wherever you listen to your podcasts.
And be prepared to be totally and utterly perplexed.
The majority of people, including Australian authorities and Antoine's family, think he is alive and started a new life in Australia. In fact, former New South Wales detective Inspector Michael Gerondis said he had no doubt that Antoine faked his death so he could stay in Australia. But what makes him so sure? Well, there are a few circumstantial clues. First, Antoine's body has never been found. While most people that jump from the gap are eventually found, they aren't all recovered. If the individual lands on the rocks at the base of the gap, the body is more likely to be recovered quickly. But if the person lands in the water, the body may drift out due to currents, tides, and waves. It would depend on where Antoine jumped from, if he jumped. Some parts of the gap have a clear drop into the ocean, but others are bordered by jagged rocks and uneven terrain. So if he landed in the water, there are strong currents that can carry a body away from the site of impact. In some cases, bodies have been carried out to sea. However, ocean conditions may eventually cause the body to wash ashore somewhere else along the coast. This can take days, weeks, or longer, depending on the circumstances. I think it's a possibility Antoine jumped and his body was carried out to sea. It could have washed ashore weeks later, and they didn't realize it was him because they focused on him being alive. DNA technology was available in Australia in 1998, but not at the level we have today. So it's possible he jumped and never washed ashore, or his body did show up and they just didn't realize it was him. But when authorities were asked if he could have jumped and been washed away by the sea, investigator Jaundice said, "There's no way in the world. It doesn't make sense. He's here. I just don't know what he's doing." Now, back to that strange circumstantial evidence I mentioned earlier. Antoine was scheduled to attend a party for a friend shortly after he made it back to France, but he never showed up. Flowers that had been pre-ordered before his disappearance were delivered in his absence. Now, why would someone order flowers to be delivered at a party they were supposed to be at, unless they weren't planning on showing up? This led his family to further believe he not only faked his death, but also hatched a rather elaborate plan to do so. Were these flowers the one clue he left for his family and friends to let them know he was alive but chose to live his life without them? Anything's possible. Another strange clue was that when authorities found his backpack, there was a card in there from a karaoke type of venue where you pay for women's company, if you know what I mean. He was telling people that he had been going to this establishment and having fun with various women. But when they started asking around, they found that he had actually never been there. Now, why would he lie about something like that? Well, according to his family, there was a possibility Antoine was gay, and he was hiding it from his family and friends. Coming from a small town in France in the 1990s, it's possible he felt it was something people around him wouldn't accept. That gave police more reason to believe he faked his own death. The flowers, along with telling people he was partying with these women, was all part of his master plan. And with that new information, a few years after his disappearance, police turned to Sydney's gay and lesbian community to try to solve the mystery. Detectives at the New South Wales Police Commercial Crime Agency, or the CAA, asked members of the community to come forward if they recognized Antoine. But not one single person came forward saying they ever saw Antoine. Police are still convinced he's alive, and they believe he's been lying low all these years with a new identity, living in Australia somewhere. Investigator Gerondis told the Daily Mail he believes Antoine is 100% alive and in Queensland or up in the Northern Territory. Antoine loved the beach, the hot weather, and the sun. The investigators said Antoine didn't want to go back to cold, old, rainy France and stayed in Australia. And although he hasn't reached out to a single family member or friend or anyone that knows him in over 20 years, his family also thinks he's alive. They say that he's definitely the kind of person who would do this instead of having to go through the immigration process. His father said there was no way Antoine would take his own life. Antoine's sister Sophie went on the Missing Podcast Australia and said that despite being angry about flying out to identify his body, she hoped he would make contact with them. She said, "I love you and hope you are fine, you feel good, and you feel happy in your life. 22 years ago, you made a choice. I can accept your choice, but you must only tell us you are alive, because we need to know. For us, our parents, you must tell us you are alive. For us, it is too difficult to live like that. Every day I think of you. Every day I remember you." And she said she has a recurring dream about her brother, saying, "I turn around and recognize him immediately. In this dream, I saw him with a woman with long blonde hair and 2 children." And this has put a huge strain on Antoine's family. With his sister Sophie telling the Missing Podcast Australia, "In reality, I think that wanting to find a missing person is purely selfish, but also an act full of love. Selfish because I would like to know if he is alive, so that I can see him at least once and know that despite all these years, he is happy to have made this terrible choice. People can think what they want. It's normal. They say to themselves, if he disappeared of his own volition, it is because he had reasons, so let him live quietly. These people do not know the suffering of waiting to know the truth about the disappearance, the tearing apart between family members, friends, or others." Now, I think if Antoine had heard her pleas for him to reach out, he would have. And there's really no reason for him not to reach out at this point. He's not in any trouble, and he wouldn't be arrested or deported. His family would simply get answers, and he could be taken off the missing persons registrar. With renewed efforts in this case, and the belief that Antoine is still alive and living in Australia, police have initiated DNA testing in the hope of tracking down any children Antoine may have in Australia. But of course, this goes against their other theory that Antoine had to start a new life in Australia because he had been hiding his sexuality. I think authorities believe Antoine is alive because they're going off a gut feeling. And I'm not about to say a gut feeling isn't real, but I do find it odd that they haven't been able to come up with a single direct clue that he's out there. If Antoine is alive, I hope he reaches out to his family to give them the closure and peace they deserve. Now, I'll be covering some safety tips for visiting Australia. But first, I want to talk for a moment about suicide and suicide tourism. This may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. If you're feeling vulnerable or this topic might be too heavy for you right now, please take care of yourself and skip this part of the episode. If you're feeling overwhelmed, hopeless, or like you can't go on, you're not alone. It's okay to feel this way, but please know there is help available. Reaching out for support is not a sign of weakness. It's one of the bravest things you can do. Whether it's talking to a trusted friend, family member, or a counselor, sharing what you're going through can make a huge difference. If you or someone you know is struggling, reach out to a trusted person or call a crisis hotline in your area. In Australia, you can contact Lifeline at 131114. And in the US, you can call 988. Your well-being is important, so please prioritize it as you listen. The Gap in Australia is a well-known spot for suicide tourism. This is the phenomenon where people travel to a particular location, usually away from their home country or region, with the intent of ending their lives. Assisted suicide tourism is when someone travels to countries or jurisdictions where assisted suicide or euthanasia is legally permitted. Switzerland is one of the most well-known destinations for this, and they have organizations there that provide assistance to individuals that meet their criteria. It's people who are facing terminal illnesses, chronic pain, or degenerative conditions who feel that this is their best option and want the right to die with dignity. But there are also destination-based suicides in places like the Gap in Australia, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, or Beachy Head in the UK. People may travel to these destinations because of their association with suicides, or the location may hold personal, cultural, or emotional significance. These locations may be chosen because they are iconic or have symbolic meaning, while others may be drawn by the perceived finality of the setting. Some people prefer to travel away from their home region or country to avoid stressing their loved ones or to stay anonymous. Regardless of why a specific location is chosen, suicide tourism is a complex and sensitive phenomenon tied to issues of mental health, autonomy, legality, and ethics. Many of these places have taken steps towards prevention and support. Most display contact information for crisis helplines and install physical barriers or monitoring systems. Addressing suicide tourism is as much about preventing suicide in general as it is about securing specific locations. A compassionate, community-driven approach can make a significant difference. Please make the choice to ask for help if you need it, and know that you are not alone. If you plan on visiting Sydney, Australia, there are a few things to keep in mind. The first you should know is that Aussies are known for being laid back and friendly. So be polite and respectful, and you'll usually receive the same in return. Sydney is a big city, so like anywhere else, keep your bags zipped and your valuables close in case of pickpocketing. Avoid poorly lit areas at night, especially if you're alone, and stick to the main streets. Sydney has quite the nightlife, so enjoy it responsibly. Watch your drinks to avoid drink spiking, don't drink and drive, and just don't drink too much. Drugs are not legal there, and penalties for possession and use can be severe. So it's important to understand and respect local drug laws and avoid legal trouble. Be careful in the ocean. There are rip currents at the beach, jellyfish which can sting, and of course, the occasional shark attack. Only swim at patrolled beaches between the red and yellow flags where lifeguards are present. If you're hiking, wear sturdy shoes, watch the weather updates, and be aware of snakes, spiders, and other animals. And never go hiking alone. And most importantly, no matter where you're traveling, make sure you inform someone about your plans before going anywhere. Tell someone reliable where you're going and what you'll be doing and when to expect you back. My number one tip for staying alive on vacation is to pay attention to your gut. If something doesn't feel right, it isn't. Antoine Herran would now be 54 years old. He is described as Caucasian, 5 feet, 9 inches tall, with a medium build. He has brown hair and blue eyes. He also has a scar on his stomach in the shape of a question mark from an operation he had as a child. He was last seen wearing beige trousers, a yellow jacket, and an Akubra hat. He normally has thick round glasses and protruding ears. He can speak 3 languages and may be trying to pass himself off as Italian. Antoine's family has been dealing with his loss for 26 long, brutal years. They deserve to know what happened to him or if he's still out there. Antoine is an incredibly distinct-looking person with very prominent ears and a French accent. He is thought to have potentially moved to Queensland or the Northern Territory. Antoine, if you are listening to this, call your sister, call your parents. Let them know you're okay. You are missed. If you know anything about Antoine Herran's whereabouts, or if you know anything about what happened to him, please contact the NSW Police at 131-444 or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000 or make a report online. Detective Michael Gerondis is the lead investigator on this case, and he's waiting for your call. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/thelasttrippodcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.